about ready? Hello. Thank you. My name's Kathy Gooch, and I'm here from Canterbury Christchurch University. And it's an enormous personal privilege for me to have the job of welcoming and introducing Professor Ken Goodman to this very special UKLA audience, but also at this very special anniversary conference. Along with other young teachers in the 1970s, while we faced similar madness and challenges as we are now, the psycholinguistic guessing game and the introduction of a new vocabulary to guide us to understand children as they were reading was, to say the very least, extraordinarily, supremely helpful. What has continued to help, though, is Ken's emphasis on listening to children and observing them as they read, and his sustained, robust research with children and those who work with them, teaching us all to watch, listen and learn from children as readers. And with his own continued learning evident in the pages of his publications, we've been guided through research into reading, challenged and driven forward through his debates, as he alerts us to political contentions, deconstructing rhetoric, and reminding us of the need to question and better understand motives and texts, as well as readers. And all of this with a passionate belief in the strength and abilities of teachers and young learners, and of the power of research to support them. With you, I'm very much looking forward to this session, and so it's with great pleasure that I now introduce to you Professor Ken Goodman. Thank you.
Thanks for a wonderful introduction. Can you hear me okay back there? We have a joke in our family. Yetta has the big voice and I have the small one in some situations. I've given myself the ambitious undertaking. Can't hear? Let's see if I can get this up. Okay now? Can you hear me now? Yes, you can hear. Okay. I'll hold it. Yeah. Okay. I gave myself the ambitious, overly ambitious thing of telling you everything that we've learned in 50 years and addressing it to Edmund Huey, who in 1908 wrote his book, The Psychology and Pedagogy of Reading, and who said, I'll show you what he said in a moment. Those early researchers were aware that they should start with readers, and the only thing that they could observe was their eye movement, so that's where they began. We've come around full circle with combining our movements with miscue analysis. We call it AMA, eye movement miscue analysis, and it gives a powerful insight. But what I wanted to say is that they recognized at that time that you start with looking at the process. They couldn't figure out how to get into the brain, so they looked at the eye. And then they were interested, as his book indicated, in how that applies to what teachers could do. I started from that basis. I didn't start out to study reading. I started out to figure out what teachers needed to know to help kids to read. And if you followed my writing, I've always been interested in how we give information to teachers and get feedback from them. It's a two-way kind of street. So early in my career, I came to Wayne State University from UCLA with a fresh doctorate. I didn't study reading, and some people have reminded me that I didn't study reading in my dissertation. But I came there with a smattering of linguistic knowledge and the notion that we ought to be able to study reading as a language process. Later, I began to realize a psycholinguistic process. So this is an example of some of the things that miscue analysis was able to show us. If you did an old informal reading inventory, that would have counted as 4 or 5 errors. Miscues are the term that I adopted rather than error because it was a non-prejudicial way of looking at what kids were doing and realizing that what they did was the same when they made miscues as when they were producing expected responses. So in this case, the child was reading from a book called Mrs. Frisbee and the Rats of NIM. NIM is the National Institute of Mental Health, and it's a rat who's discovered how to read. And he says, it says now he understood why the children had been calling his name, and this reader read, now I understand why the children have been calling my name. The meaning hasn't changed, but he shifted it into a direct quotation from the rat character who's reading this, who then figures out how to open the cage and they escape. So you get a sense of that this gave us a window on the reading process. We could see between what we expected and what the reader responded, observed and expected responses, something about what was going on in the head in the process of reading. This is what Edmund Huey had said, and I won't read it to you, but essentially he's saying that it would be the height of a psychologist's achievement if we understood reading, we'd understand the brain. He was very true of that, except it took more than psychologists to do that. It took people like Margaret Spencer, a literature person, Brian Street, David Barton, my buddy, mate, he would say, Brian Camborne, who just was honored by the Queen, and it's about time. We don't have those kinds of honors in the States. A wide range of people with different perspectives to begin to understand the reading process, including my colleague Steve Strauss, who's a neurologist and a linguist and has been helping us to understand how the brain works. I'll talk about a little bit of that as we go along. So we needed a wide range of people to understand this because it's a brain process. Human language is universal among humans, and I'm starting here for a very important reason. I think we have underestimated what the average child, not the average child, but almost all children are able to achieve by the time they're 3 years old. Human language is universal for 3 basic reasons. We all have the ability to think symbolically, that is, to represent ideas and experiences and things with meaningless symbols, and so manipulate them. We're also social beings that need to connect, and in using connect as a broader way than communicating, because we connect in a lot of ways besides communicating. And the third thing is that human beings are intelligent. There wouldn't be much point in language if we didn't have something to say to each other. And each child invents language in the context of the social language that surrounds them. And gradually that language becomes constrained. There is a kind of constraint between the inventive process and the conventions of the social language, so that the child's language moves toward the language of the community, because we have to communicate with each other, we have to connect with each other. And at the same time that our inventions move toward the social language, the inventions change the language, so that language is continuously being changed, partly because we need to say more things, but partly because change is inevitable. And you have only to go to an old movie to listen to the language of the previous generation and realize how stale it gets. It's the young people and the people on the fringes of society that are contributing to that change. I've been very fortunate. I've had access to a lot of classrooms all over the world to do research, and particularly in the communities that I worked in Detroit and Tucson. But I've also had close at hand 3 generations of children, grandchildren, and here are 4 of my great-grandchildren. And I wanted to talk a little bit about, to help you understand what I mean by invention. Israel, who's 6 years old, and who's a recent graduate of what I call a sweatshop kindergarten. You know what I mean by that? They go all day, they don't have breaks, they don't have naps, they do worksheets. She has worksheets to take home. She had an argument with her mother, my granddaughter, a few weeks ago because they were supposed to fill in the vowel and trigraphs. And she insisted it was a U because it was the sound. And of course it was a schwa. And Shoshana, my granddaughter, was explaining that to her. She insisted, no, the teacher said it's always a. So that unteaching is what I want to talk about a little later. Ezreal started her language by focusing on intonation. Have you known children like that? Once she picked up a doorstop, those spring doorstops, and held it up to her, and she was clearly imitating the radio newscaster. But it was all intonation. She hadn't the phonology. Well, now she's 6 years old, and she speaks. We have nice conversations on Skype. By the way, we Skype so much that when they see us in person, they're a little startled. Juliet is 4, and she took the more typical path, gradually saying things that expanded and began to be conversational. Her little brother Levi, who is just going to celebrate, in fact, I think today is his 3rd birthday. Juliet was 4 in January, and she wanted to go to the dinosaur exhibit at the Houston Museum. And we're walking through, and I said to Levi, this is about science. And he said, I knew that. He didn't know that, but he knew that when somebody says, did you know that? The response is, I knew that. So he has this salient kinds of things. Jonathan wanted me to tell you that when he was 2 years old, he announced in a crowded dining room that he said, I'm stinky. That's salient also. Another example is he introduced my daughter, his maternal grandmother, who he calls Zavta. He said Zavta and introduced her to his paternal grandfather. Zavta, this is Papi. Knowing that they might not know each other and it was socially important. Madison took another, that's their little cousin, who's 3.5 now. Madison moved from to conversational language before she had fully controlled the phonology. She speaks grammatically, but not always. So when she sings a song, it's wah, 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 instead of la, 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 la. And the other day, she was at our house, and she said, I'd like to go to the book area. And it's the kind of control of language. I don't think anybody said that's the book area, but she put that together herself. So you have 4. We have 2 more, and Arabella, who's just learning to walk, 9 months, took her first steps at our house. And then she and I were doing the turn-taking. She would say, ma, 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 and I'd say, ma, 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 and she'd say, wah, 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 and I'd say, wah, wah, wah. And we kept that up until I lost interest. But you see this invention of language, but moving toward the social language. Now, what's important about that is that by the time these children are 3 years old, they have learned something remarkable, and it's so universal that we've taken it for granted and not treated it as important enough. They've learned the grammar, they've learned a wide vocabulary, they've learned the pragmatics of who you speak and which ways. And children have to learn that. I was in a cafe once, And I could see a mother standing waiting to pay the bill. And she was saying, sit down. I told her to sit down, so I knew there was a child. And then the child came over and pulled on her and said, sit down. I told you to sit down. Well, she can say that to him, but he can't say that to her. And kids have to learn those things. So they've learned that language is social. They've learned that it's communicative. They've learned that it's interpersonal. And they've learned that it's psycholinguistic. In the process, they've learned the systems of one or more languages. And we were in Soweto in South Africa, and the receiving room in this school sang, these 4-year-olds sang the national anthem in 4 languages for us. The children learn the languages that they need. They can attend to the systems of sounds that are the signs of language. They've learned the wording and the grammar of the language, and they learn to use the language to express what they need to say and understand what other people have learned to say. Now, I'm emphasizing that because when we start to say, how do we teach and what is it that we're trying to teach when we teach to read and write, they haven't lost this ability to learn language when they turn to written language. And we have tended to treat them as beginners who need to be taught something from the beginning instead of building on the strengths that they already have, that universal strength. They accomplish all this without any instruction. Inevitably, written language, this is another thing that I want to emphasize. Written language is not something new or different. It's not non-language. It's the inevitable progression of language when you need to communicate personally or socially over time and space. And originally, written language developed for that purpose. I'll give you some examples here. That's the printing press, in case the first Gutenberg printing press. And I want to say, and I've said it before, it isn't that the Gutenberg printing press made mass literacy possible. It's that the need for mass literacy made the Gutenberg press possible. Had it been invented at another time and place, and maybe it was, it wouldn't have taken. Why do we have Xerox stores on every corner? Why do you have a printer in your own office now where you can print in as many fonts as you want? It's because of this need. And the cartoon that I have there, you see slow children texting. That's another inevitable kind of thing. We have children now that are coming to school already literate because they've learned to read and write like they learned to talk because they needed to. Why do they need to? Because the other kids are doing that. Because it's possible, because they have the devices. I wish I could convince the people who've made fortunes in the internet and in digital devices that instead of telling us how to teach reading, they should be making their devices universally available. The internet should be as free as the air is that it travels through. And that's not uncommon watch out for the kids because they're texting on the way to school. I said that reading is a psycholinguistic guessing game, and I was using that kind of as a metaphor when I started out, but it's not a metaphor, it's true. And brain research, as my colleague Steve Strauss has been helping us to understand, is showing that prediction, that is knowing what's coming, is the way the brain operates. The reason why you understand why I'm speaking is that you're able to anticipate. We share a grammar. As Shaw said, the English language is American and British English separated by an ocean. And there are times when I'm going to say some things and you don't quite catch it because my dialect and my terminology is different than yours. But basically, you're predicting what I'm going to say, and you're assigning a grammatical system to it, and you're able then to, within your experience and understanding, create a text that's parallel to mine. You don't, when you read, understand the author's text. It's the text that you construct, because there's nothing but you're just looking at squiggles on a screen there. The meaning isn't in the text. I created a text, hopefully that you would understand. I'm saying one now, but you're creating a text that you understand. And yours is influenced by your values, your experiences. In fact, when people criticize my reading model, they're proving it. Because when they misinterpret what I'm saying, that proves that they're constructing their own text and then criticizing that instead of what I think I said. Modern brain theory is confirming my intuition, in other words, and reading is definitely an exemplar of the brain at work. We can't think differently when we're reading than when we're doing other kinds of things. The things that I described as reading strategies are general strategies that the brain uses. There used to be a view, and this I got from Steve Strauss, that the thalamus is where the sensory input goes in, and that kind of screens what goes to the brain. What they've discovered since then is there are 10 times as many neurons going from the cortex to the thalamus as from the thalamus to the cortex, which means that the eye isn't rambling around and then feeding information to the brain. The brain says to the eye, here's where you want to go, and this is what you want to find, and this is what I'm looking for. So the brain is controlling the sensory inputs and then making sense of it. And there is that constant control. Einstein says, the intuitive mind, I'll read this to you, is a sacred gift, and the irrational mind is a faithful servant. We've created a society that honors the servant but has forgotten the gift. I don't know whether you know that he spent the theoretical and the research physicists always were a little bit at odds. And Einstein had to defend the fact that he was making intuitive contributions to physics that then the physicists had to go and check out, and it turned out he was often right. He never conducted an experiment. They were all in his head. What a head, right? But the important thing is that most science begins with intuition. My intuition was the psychoanalysis guessing game, but it was based on my early MISCU research. I'm going to quickly go through some key principles of what I've learned about reading, what we've learned about reading. And then I want to move to what this means for teaching, what teachers do. So reading is a process that the brain uses to construct meaning. And construct meaning is another way of saying making sense. It's wrong to say, what did you get from that? Did that make sense to you? Is what we should be saying. Can you make sense of that? You're making sense of what you're reading. Making sense is constructing meaning. And that's what reading is. It's a process of constructing meaning from a written text. The text is there. It's only squiggles on a page. You've got to make sense of it. If I'm doing a good job as a speaker or a writer, and I'm creating a potential, but all I can do is create the potential, you have to make sense. A writer needs a sense of audience. You need to think about what will they know that I can use to make this sensible to them. But you make sense. The text does not have meaning. The meaning is always in the head of the writer and the reader. Or whether oral or written, then it's just a set of abstractions. And to make sense of what is read, the reader must bring meaning to the text. When I sign a legal contract, I don't trust myself to comprehend it. I hire a lawyer to do that for me, to tell me what I'm getting myself into. Nobody is totally literate in every respect. All of us know that there are some things we can't make sense of because we don't have enough meaning to bring to it. And it's one thing about textbooks that I've always been concerned about. Many times teachers feel that the textbook is where the information is, and we rely on the kids to get it from there, but we have to help them to build enough meaning to make sense of what they're reading. And that's Probably textbooks are the worst written books. So I'm going to let you read that for a minute. What does it say? What does it say? What if I told you you read the first line wrong? But what does it really say? So do you read word by word sequentially? No. You constructed meaning from that, and most people, my lawyer grandson immediately read it the way it's written, what I have told you. But most of you are just saying the I if. You read it as what if I. How many of you read it as what if I? Okay. We've done a lot with things like this to demonstrate that we have paragraphs that we've used where there are 6 or 8 errors. We had a replication of this in Chinese, and it works the same way. You make sense of it, and you miss the errors because you know you're predicting what's going to be there, and you see enough to project. Now, the point is that meaning is constructed in your head, and it's not sequential. My former student, Eric Polson, was a skeptic, so he looked at the eye movement research, and it's been consistent for a long time. You only fixate on about 2/3 of the words that you're reading. That's efficient. You don't need to fixate on all the words. In fact, the first fixation is very seldom at the first word of a line. You're down a couple of words because you've already predicted what you're going to see. And as you predict, you look for proof of what you're predicting, and you don't need to use the rest. Function words, those little words like prepositions and articles and verb copulas and things like that, you get half as many fixations on those because they're predictable and you don't need to fixate on them. When you look at a transcript of what the eye was doing and what the mouth was saying, and by the way, there's no wire between the mouth and the eye. It all goes through the brain. So it's not what you see, it's what you think you see that's most important. Okay. It's a little bit of thing about the eye there. There's a grand illusion. You think you look at all the words and all the letters, but in fact you don't. The eye is an optical instrument. It has to fixate. You don't get any input while it's moving. And the brain is telling the eye where to look and what to look for. We think we see all the letters and the words, but we don't. And I have a little thing from William Blake. Poets are very good about this. This life's 5 windows of the soul distorts the heaven from pole to pole and leads you to believe a lie when you see with, but not through the eye. The eye is giving you information, but the brain is what perceives. And when you perceive the things that you have already predicted and that fit your expectations. In relation to the brain and the eye, the images from the eye are sent to the thalamus. As I said, they go to the cortex. But the cortex, which is where we do our thinking and bring it all together, that's telling the eye what to look for and turning the visual input into perceptions, which are based on what you expected. What you think you see is most important, more important than what you actually see. Paul Kohlers, who's the one who resurrected the work of Edmund Huey and got MIT Press to republish it in 1968, 60 years after it was written, did some experimentations. His subjects were at hand. They were Harvard students and MIT students. So he gave them tortured texts and things like that, turned the things upside down and backwards to see what they would do with it. And he discovered they could read the tortured text because they were focused on making sense. Then when he showed them real text, it took them a while to. But his view was that, let me go back again. Pushed the wrong button. Paul Kohlers wrote an article called Reading is Only Incidentally Visual. And the point is that it isn't the eye that we make sense with, it's the brain, of course. What's that thing? It's the brain, stupid. Now, I'm going to give you some big ideas. Making sense of written language, more big ideas. Uses basically the same process as making sense of oral language. And oral language uses sounds and written language uses graphic shapes, but both use grammar and wording. So when you're learning to read and write a language that you already speak, you have a lot of the abilities that you've already been able to make sense of oral language. It's just a different form and a different semiotic system. How well any reader can read of anything that's being read depends on how efficient and effective the reader is. Efficiency is getting to the meaning with the least amount of effort. Effectiveness is getting to meaning. Put those together and you get proficiency. But effective reading is what makes sense of what's reading. And when I say make sense, it doesn't mean that you get the exact meaning of the author. You can't, because you have different experiences, different values that you bring to it. But what you're trying to do, both the author and the reader, is agreeing on getting the meaning. I want to say a little bit about speed here, because we had fortunes made by people teaching speed reading, and there is a correlation between how fast you read and comprehension. But it isn't the speed, it's the efficiency. It's how well you use the cues that are available to you. So just reading fast doesn't get you to meaning, but reading efficiently, using the best cues available in the least amount of time and effort, that's what makes it possible. So that speed is the byproduct, it isn't the cause of that. I want to talk a little bit now about what this means for instruction. And essentially what I'm coming back to now is that if children have this universal ability to learn language, it must be because there's something about the human brain that's organized much the way language is. How does the brain organize the information? Well, it has to represent it in some symbolic sense. We may not quite understand what that symbolic sense is, but it corresponds to the symbolic way that we represent it in language. It has to be systematic, it has to be ordered, but the brain also has the ability to be very flexible. That's why the same word can mean different things. That's why the same sound in a sequence can have different values. It's what Peter Fries and I have been calling the ability to deal with ambiguity. Ambiguity is something the brain deals with easily. Variability, being able to assign different values to the same kind of input so that we can deal with imperfect speech. And I want to take a minute to talk about that. If we all had to speak in a single way perfectly, communication would be impossible. So our remarkable brains have the ability to take variation and treat it as the same, to hear different voices. Think about a child who's learning language who hears the high-pitched voice of the mother and the low-pitched voice of the father and the different voices of the children, and can sort out of that the things that are linguistically significant despite all that difference. Well, the brain has this ability. That's why language is easy to learn. When we turn language into a set of abstractions, phonemic sounds, teaching kids phonics out of context, that's hard to learn because 5, 6 year olds aren't very good at dealing with abstraction. Language is easy to learn, abstraction is hard. And then we think we're making it easy by breaking things down into abstract bits and making those prerequisite. want to give you the worst example. Dibbles is the creature of a group of people, behaviorists, who decided that direct instruction is the way to teach, and who invented a test with U.S. government money and then have made a fortune on it. And were able, when No Child Left Behind, they were given the opportunity to impose their test on. Every kid in Arizona has to, or the teachers think they have to have Dibbles. My little great-granddaughter in her sweatshop kindergarten had this. And here's one of the tests that they get. You see those trigraphs. You may notice that a couple of them make sense in Spanish, and if you give those in Tucson, Arizona, there are kids who think that they're... Anyway, that's prerequisite to then getting to read something. The World Bank and Hewlett Foundation and USAID have turned this into AGRA, early grade reading assessment, and are testing kids in Africa and Latin America and South America. So here's, that's the, and there's an African language. Nonsense is nonsense no matter what language you're writing. And they're proving, and I have a wonderful quote from Einstein again, always, always trust your first gut instincts. If you feel in your heart and soul that something is wrong, it probably is. A lot of money is being wasted on convincing kids in Africa and other places that they can't read using this kind of... Now, that's an extreme example, but I'm going to paraphrase. This isn't what Brian Camber's conditions of learning are, but these are my... what makes language easy to learn, and some of you may remember I did a little chart called What Makes Language Easy and What Makes It Hard. If it meets an immediate need, such as connecting with peers through texting and email, it's easy to learn. And we have millions of kids coming to school already reading and writing because they have access to digital devices. It's accessible. If it's accessible in digital and more traditional materials, it develops in the context of use, and the learner is in control of the process. I was interested in David Crystal's comments to me that he was doing some studies where the kids were happily texting until it became part of the school curriculum, and then they weren't interested anymore. Conditions are making it hard to break the process of reading down into sequence of abstractions to be learned out of context, reify the sequence as reading. Once we take reading and writing and make them school subjects, we have to have a sequence. We have to start someplace and end someplace. We were in Israel, and they told us that the English curriculum, they introduced past tense in the third semester. It's hard to speak a language without past tense. And we have this notion that you simplify it. Caesar was part of a group of grammarians that believed in the language should be perfect, so he took all the imperfections in Latin and regularized them, which is why if you studied Latin, you used Caesar's diaries. But that was a misunderstanding of the way language works. Language is imperfect for a reason. If it were perfect, we couldn't use it. So breaking the process down into a sequence of abstractions makes it hard. Taking those abstractions then and reifying them. I want to tell you a little story. How's my time? All right. Yetta and a graduate student that we've been working with, she'd been tutoring this 8-year-old who had Dibbles from the beginning of school, who came into, they were doing a seminar on retrospective miscue analysis, and so they were bringing this boy in each time, and she'd been tutoring him. He announced that he couldn't read, that he was the worst reader in his class. And he'd been trying to use what he'd been taught. Now, what I want to emphasize is this ability to learn language doesn't stop when you go to school. So all the time that he was being taught one set of strategies, his mind was using another set of strategies to try and make sense. Well, it took them within 4 months, they had helped him to use what he knew, and he was doing much better. Yet I had one situation where she had prepared a lesson on the basis of a little book that he was reading, where there was one place that was recurrent. And as he was sitting waiting, he pulled this big book over and solved the problem for himself, so she didn't have a lesson for him to read because he had figured out what was going on. What they did was liberate him to use the strategies that were normal for him and that were making sense, and set aside the ones that... And when Kelly, our graduate student who'd been working with him, went to the school and showed him what they was doing, they said, yes, he's made remarkable progress. It must be because of the teaching we've been doing with him, which of course... And then they said, but, you know, he has this habit of making educated guesses, and we're going to have to work on him to get him to stop doing that. Oh, boy. Requiring evidence of mastery of these abstractions as we build tests that are based on the curriculum, and we reify that so that it doesn't matter whether the kids are reading and making sense. They're not passing the test, so they have to get more and more. And what happens then is that most kids, I'm deeply convinced of this, we learn to read in spite of the instruction, not because of the instruction. And when the instruction is too heavily, we had a colleague who came to work with us for a while who talked about the instruction-dependent strategies. That is, kids who are handicapped by believing that they have to use certain kinds of things. You know, if I asked you how many of you are really good readers, I'd get half-mast. Because we've convinced people, a lot of kids, that in spite of learning to read, they think they're cheating because they're not doing it the way they were supposed to do it. And that carries over into writing then. And of course, if kids are not doing well in reading, they never get to write. So you get that sweatshop kindergarten I was telling you about. The kids are spending all day, and they'll do this for the next couple of years in that school, learning these reading skills, these abstractions. And they don't have time for anything else because, after all, reading is so important. This old notion that first you read to learn to read and then you read to learn is exactly wrong. You can't learn to read unless you're reading for some purpose. And so every time we're teaching, we should be teaching language. We require reading mastery in order to move ahead. And I've been in schools, you know, wonderful whole language classrooms that were full of books. And they've had to take the books away because they were distracting the kids from the reading. Literally, I've had people tell me that. I want to come to what is my main conclusion and something I'm going to spend my remaining days campaigning for. You know, we have in the States, and I imagine you have it here, to this response to instruction, where you experiment and you give the kids the things that they respond to, and it all comes back to phonics anyway. I want to talk about responsive teaching, where we're responding to what the kids are doing. My good friend Frank Smith said a long time ago, he wrote an article called 12 Easy Ways to Make Learning to Read Hard, and One Hard Way to Make It Easy. And the hard way to make it easy is to figure out what the kids are doing and help them do it. Get in tune with them and support them. There is no sequence of skills in literacy development. There can't be. The way that language develops, it has to be in the context of hearing it used. The reason why my brilliant great-grandchildren are all learning to talk and to speak intelligibly is because they have language surrounding them. They hear it, they respond to it, they gradually get to the point where they're communicating with us and each other. I have a colleague who spent some time working in Africa studying baboons, and she had her little son with her, and the only kid his age was an African child who spoke no English. And they invented a language together, those two little kids. And she's spending her time now analyzing the transcripts that she had of this. You know, both siblings and twins invent languages. Kids are always inventing language, and they move toward the social norms because they need to. Well, we can do that with literacy. We give them situations where they need it, where we support what they're already doing, and they suddenly become good learners. They're not failures. Like all language, literacy develops in the context of its use. I love the term digital natives. My great-grandchildren are digital natives. My grandchildren are kind of semi-digital natives. They're certainly much better at it than I do. I love to sit on a plane and watch people with their thumbs, and you can kind of age grade them, although some of the parents are getting pretty good at that. David Crystal said the kids have, you know, the abbreviations that they were using. My favorite one is the POS, parents over shoulder. Well, he says the kids have stopped using that because the adults are using them. You know, we invent things and then we move on. Teachers need to build on what the learners are naturally doing and provide access. How many of you have been in schools where they won't permit the kids to use their cell phones or their digital devices? We keep doing that. There was a Meryl Streep movie called Doubt, where she was the principal of a Catholic school, and the kids were forbidden to use ballpoint pens. In math, we didn't let them use the calculators because they weren't learning to do the right stuff. Are they lamenting in England, the loss of cursive writing? Teenagers are not using cursive writing anymore. Why should they? They've got iPads and computers. That, to me, is no loss. The bane of my existence when I was a child was having to learn. We moved a lot, and every time we moved, I had to learn a new handwriting system. By the way, you know that when you copyright a handwriting textbook, it has to have so many differences from other handwriting textbooks. So we have differences just because of that kind of thing. Every time we moved, I had to make a different R. There's a story in Buenos Aires that there was a note left in the context of a murder, and everybody knew which secondary school in Buenos Aires because of the handwritten note. Immersing kids in literacy activities, but in essence, every activity in school is an opportunity to learn to read and write in the context of using it. And John Dewey said a long time ago, learning by doing. Language is much more part of that. In fact, there's a double agenda that Brooks Smith and I and the other talked about in the first book that we've done, Language and Thinking in School, that there is a double agenda. Everything that the kids do, they're doing to learn, but the teacher always is monitoring their language development in the context of what they're learning, helping them to learn not only those beginning kinds of things, but how to take notes, how to organize through language, how to get the language so that it's serving your purpose, how to express yourself. All those things, we are constantly watching the kids' language development while they're using the language that they need in order to learn. Monitoring what happens. I think I've finished a little early here, and if we have, maybe there's time for some questions. Let me summarize what I'm saying. When we have research on reading, it's tended to be research on instruction, which is exactly the wrong place to begin. We have to say first to ourselves, what is it that we're trying to teach when we teach kids to read and write? And that's to do what they have already learned in speaking and listening, and to help them to do it better. So as they become basically literate and are able to read and write, then we want to work on reading and writing critically, being able to express yourself so that people will understand you, thinking about what you're trying to say and how you organize that. But everything is advancing this in the context of its use. I would like to say, and I have to say this carefully, let's stop teaching reading and writing. Let's stop teaching them as school subjects. Let's stop making the focus on learning the skills of reading and writing, and let's rather constantly develop reading and writing in the context of its use. If they need it, they will learn it. And I don't mean need it in the sense of getting grades in school. I mean need it in the sense of feeling that they ought to do. I used to have a habit when I'd walk into a schoolroom of saying to kids, "What are you doing?" What was the most common answer I got? Schoolwork. And why are you doing that? Because the teacher said to do it. What you want to have is when you say to a kid, "What are you doing?" they can explain to you, I'm doing a report on I'm learning about this and I'm doing this. Because there needs to be a reason. Dewey said a long time ago, you don't learn for the future, you learn for the present. Things have to be significant now. I think that sometimes, and I see this with people who are our age or a generation like, you're not my age, you're a generation or so younger than me, but when we come to computers, we tend to put extra steps in instead of focusing on what is it you're trying to do. We have a young man who's been helping us with the computers. It's just preventing a lot of disagreements between Ed and me. She gets very frustrated when I can't help her with the computer. So we have this young man, and I say to him, "How did you learn this?" And he shrugs his shoulders, and he learned it by doing it, by experimenting. And that's the kind of thing that we have to keep building on and understanding. Language is easy to learn. Written language, unlike what Louisa Moat says, it's not rocket science. There's nothing hard about reading and writing. We make it hard by teaching it as abstract skills. We need to help kids to use the natural language learning ability that they have. And then suddenly they're not going to have reading problems anymore. One of the most ironic things, I mentioned Tibbles and Agra in Africa and Asia and Latin America. Here are kids who have on their own learned not one but 3 or 4 languages by the time they're 6 years old. And they come to school and we're proving to them that they can't read and write. It doesn't make sense. If you're growing up in a place where there is no literacy, there's not going to be much point in developing it. But as literacy becomes important and we have access, one of the most interesting things is that one of the computer companies decided to give tablet computers to inner city high school kids, but they programmed them in such a way that they could not do certain things with them. Guess what happened? The kids reprogrammed them. We're constantly underestimating. There is no reason why any child anywhere shouldn't be able to become literate if we understand the processes. So thank you very much. I know it's hard to stand, so I'll take that as a standing ovation.
Please do, please do. We've got 5 minutes, so it's possible to take a couple of questions if anybody would like to do that. And if you do have a question, can you, when you stand up, can you speak as loudly as you can so as many people can hear if you have a question? Okay. You want to stand up?
Okay, thank you.
You have one?
It's easier for people not to shout.
Brilliant.
See what I mean about digital letters?
Hello?
Thank you very much. I'm Jo Westbrook from here, from University of Sussex. It was very inspiring, but what is not inspiring is exactly the situation that you were outlining in Africa, where EGRA, the early grade reading assessment, has had such a hold, and where the teaching of phonics and the focus on speed and oral fluency are having such a detrimental effect, because it's all literally abstracted, as you seem to be aware, when there are no texts, although there are literacies and people all have mobile phones. So I wonder why over here and in America we're getting your messages, but the messages that are imported into Africa are around the opposite of what you're saying. Crudely put.
My friends who have been working in Africa, and we did a little work with people in Cape Town and Johannesburg. It's still the old business of the imperialist coming in and treating the people as savages. And I'm interested, where was it that you said where they all have mobile phones? Yeah. I have this vision when we were in Israel of a camel caravan, and the guy on the lead camel is talking to the guy on the back camel and the last camel on cell phones. Because we have that anomaly that we have technology coming into. I think that some of it is purely this disbelief in the ability of human beings to learn. So they're taking this technology of DIBELS and EGRA, early grade reading assessment. In Senegal, they gave tests to third graders, and they couldn't read a dozen or so words in French. Only about 1% of the people in Senegal speak French, so that's not terribly surprising. But then when they take their own language and turn it into the same kind of nonsense, they're spending millions of dollars on testing and then teaching to the test. And it's hard for a place like Gambia to turn down $50 million, even though it's wasted. Some of it, I think, in the developed countries, I believe very strongly that the people are promoting this kind of teaching are very cynical. They want to prove that public education is a failure for two reasons. One is they want to control it. The other is they don't want to spend money on it. You know, in an industrial society where you're needing less and less skilled labor, why pay wages to people that, you know, so you can run a factory. When the automobile industry supposedly recovered in Detroit, and I worked in auto factories when I was going to college, they don't need to hire back 90% of the people there. I talked to people, we were staying with a family that owns mines in Africa, and now that they have to pay the equal wages to white and black workers, they don't need them anymore. They can run a mine with a tenth of the people so that there is this notion that why educate people? And I think that's very cynical, that if you can prove that public education isn't working, then we have a veneer of educating the elite to run your factories and your equipment, and to hell with the rest of the people. It's not a very sensible kind of thing. And in the United States, we have whole industries, essentially the restaurant industry, that's run by child labor, where they're paid less than minimum wage. The big political thing that's happening in the United States is the fight for a $15 an hour minimum wage, which is still not enough to live on. But the minimum wage is under $10 an hour. Our unions have almost disappeared. So I think you have to put it in a political context. I wish that these ideas, the superintendent in the district where my great-granddaughter is going to school, when I wrote him, he said, well, you and I will disagree, but this should be between the parents and the principal. Well, the parents, my granddaughter and her husband, get no response. They're not permitted into the classroom in that situation. They bought into the notion that direct instruction and skills is the way that kids should learn. My great-granddaughter was 6 in January. There are kids who were barely 5 when they started school. She came home the first week and said, is it okay for kids to fall asleep in school because the teacher got mad at this kid? They don't have naps anymore in kindergarten. We used to joke about the kids flunking sandbox. There aren't any sandboxes anymore. They're sitting at desks and they're doing worksheets. I co-authored with Yetta and Bob Calfee and a group of others. Henrietta has a chapter in our book called Whose Knowledge Counts in Literacy Policies. And it's all over Europe, the same in France and in Germany, that the knowledge of people like us is being marginalized, and decisions are being made by politicians and captains of industry about what should happen in school. We got to change that. By the way, the place to change it was the parents, if we can educate them.
Hello? Right, thank you. I'm afraid we've run out of time for questions, but can I just say, when I emailed Professor Goodman to ask him to speak at our 50th anniversary conference, he almost immediately wrote back saying that he would be honoured to be asked and agreed to come. Well, can I just say that it's an honour for the United Kingdom Literacy Association to have you with us speaking today on our very special conference. And can I also say thank you for your generosity with your time to be here today, and that we really appreciate all your efforts to be here. I mean, for me, it's been thrilling to hear you discuss your ideas on reading, which have been so influential to so many people around the world, and for those in this room today as well, I expect. And you began your address by saying that we underestimate what children can do before the age of 3. And if I may say so, I think there is this essential humanity behind all your work, which rejects this sweatshop kindergarten response to this unfounded underestimation of young learners. And we continue to be guided by your work. And on behalf of the United Kingdom Literacy Association, thank you for your presentation today, and for all your inspirational work so far, and for the work in the future as well. So thank you very much. Can we...
Can I say just one more word? Louise Rosenblatt, who was a lot older than we are and a very wise person, used to say to us, to Ed and I, now you young people, so I'm going to say you young people, go out and do the work.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks for